we'll begin. Right, I welcome you all here to Waddesdon Strict Baptist Chapel. The chapel has been closed since 1976, and it was due to be sold, but the people that had relatives buried here objected to the building becoming a domestic dwelling. What would have happened to the tombs, what would happen, we didn't know. But a friend of friendless churches were able to purchase the property in 1986. The chapel was built in 1792 by Francis Cox, and the trustee states that they were Calvinistic, Protestant, particular Baptists. And I looked into that and realised exactly what they stood for and what they believed. Now, you might say, well, what are my credentials to come in here to speak about the particular Baptists of 1792? Because I am a young man, relatively speaking, but I was a member of the Waddesdon Strict and Particular Baptist Church back in 1984. And we were Strict and Particular Baptist, just like Waddesdon Hill. We were Gospel Standard Baptist, and we were like sister churches. We used to come from Waddesdon on an anniversary here, and Mr. Hill from Luton Strict Baptist Church would come and preach, and Mr. Collier would come from Linslade Strict Baptist and preach, and we had fellowship with the folks. So I do remember, the last church member was a Mr. Huff. He was deaf. He was deaf. And we had to speak to him, can you hear me? And that was Mr. Huff would sit here. I think he's buried here somewhere. Now, I have a personal indebtedness to the Waddesdon Strict Baptist for maintaining and preserving the truths that they taught. They taught the teachings of the gospel. In particular, they taught what we call the doctrines of grace. I'll outline those briefly later. But it is those teachings that helped me, keep me on the straight and narrow when I turned my life around years ago. And I'll tell you later about my lifestyle and what happened. Now, what I want to do, in order to tell my story, is I'm going to tell you my background, what happened to me, and so on, and then relate some of the things which are important and vital to this story I have to tell. Because Waddesdon Strict Baptist Chapel stands on a hill, right? And what they stood for were great truths, which in fact gave great help to me when I turned my life around from a life of crime and things like that. What I want to do then is start my prehistory. I was born in Oldham, 1949. I'm a young man, and I've got a brother that's a couple of years older than me, born in 1946. But sadly, he died in prison in the Philippines in 2005. Now, my brother and I, being brought up in Oldham, my mother and father were in the forces. My mother was in the Air Force, my father was in the services, he's in the army, and they were concerned about bringing up their family. To get work, they moved from Oldham, Lancashire, down to south, to Watford, when I was 5 or 6 years old. Now, when we moved to Watford, my mum used to take us to a Sunday school. And I can remember the Sunday school there. I remember going there. I don't remember my brother being with me, but I remember the congregational minister teaching about the Easter story. Now, the story of Easter is that they took Jesus and they crucified him. The Jews took him. They used the Roman governor, whoever he was, to Pilate, to have him crucified. And I didn't know why Jesus allowed that to happen, because I thought, if he is who he is, why didn't he get down from that cross, trample on his enemies, and overcome them? But he didn't. He allowed them to crucify him. I didn't know the reason for that until years later when I learned myself. So, my brother and I were naughty lads. My brother got in trouble with stealing things. He got a paper round. I began to steal things, and we began to get involved in all kinds of things. We got flint knives, we got crossbows, We got air rifles, knives, axes, and we used to hide them in the shed in the back of the garden. And we used to get into trouble, minor trouble, with young delinquents. And I'm talking about lads of 12 years old. Right? My brother was older than me, so he would have been 13, 14 years old. Well, we then moved to Wilston. My mother and father wanted to branch out to do something useful apart from working. They bought a shop, a village shop in Wilston, which is not far from here. They run the second village shop. But coming from Watford to a village was very difficult to integrate. We were from a town, they said from London, from Watford, that is the Wilston village. But my brother got into trouble with the police, I got in trouble with the police. So I found a shotgun in a farmer's barn and took it away, and the policeman came to interview me and took it away, and I got into trouble. My brother, he had made a knuckle duster at school, Tring Secondary Model School, and he hit a boy with this knuckle duster, taking my moped that I had that drove around the field. He got sent to detention centre to Kidlington. Now, I didn't really understand what was going on because I would probably be 13 years old. My mother, living in the village, had to live with the reputation her boys are troublesome. Now, it's only when I look back do I see the grief that I caused my parents. Mum virtually went through a nervous breakdown. She was prescribed the pills that the Rolling Stones used to sing about, the Librin tablets, to keep her on the straight, keep her on an even keel. And they moved from Watford to Aylesbury. So when we moved to Aylesbury, my brother, before we moved, coming out of the detention centre, he assaulted a policeman in Tring at the youth club. Then he got sent to detention centre again, Kidlington again, second round. So Mum was going really round the bend with her lads getting into trouble. So we moved to Aylesbury, and my brother made his way into the town and got mixing with the young lads. You know, 16-year-old, 17-year-old it was, come out of Waddesdon. When you've been in prison as a youngster, meeting amongst criminals, youngsters, you have a reputation, and you have to live up to a reputation, and you get worse and worse. This is what happened with my brother. Soon, he got in trouble with the police again, he stole some cars, and he got sent off to Borstal, Rochester Borstal. So, my brother was a Borstal boy at the age of 17 or 18. Now, at that time, I didn't know too much about my brother's lifestyle because Mum kept it from me. But we were like peas in a pod. The way he was, I was. I inherited his motor scooter, a Lamborghini. And that gave me wheels to get around. And when I moved to the town, I met these teenagers and youngsters that knew my brother. And I realised that my brother had a reputation. And I began to live up to the reputation. If my brother was bad, I would be even worse. And I'd do whatever he did, because it was fun and exciting. We never cared about anybody, really, not parents. We got involved in drug taking, stealing, drinking, you name it, we would get up to it. We didn't care. We thought we was having a good time. Now at that time, I was in a pop group, a rock group. We called it the Foul Mean. And Sue here, her brother, was the bass guitarist. And we used to play around Aylesbury. And I'm told by the lead singer who's not here, Malcolm Kirkham, that we were quite a good band. I wasn't really very good. I played rhythm guitar, but the point is, we loved rock and real music. We went to places, we played at Courts Dance Hall, people knew who we were. My brother was in Borstal, I lived in the limelight of popularity, and I began to, what was it, into drugs, right, into sex, into living out, just having a good time. People would have known me and said, oh, Dave Club, he's up to, I don't know, daughter, up to some fun. And we thought we was having a good time. But at that time, I met a Christian woman. I worked for a husband that was a villain. He's dead now. But she was a Christian. And what she told me about my lifestyle, I thought she was mad. I thought to myself, she said that all the things that I was doing was wrong. had this view that to go to the cinema was wrong, to go dancing was wrong, to drink was wrong, to dance was wrong. Everything that I thought was great fun, it was wrong. She said my life was sinful. She's crazy. So I mocked the religion, mocked her. Okay? Well, I did. And, well, that's the way it was. So my brother was in Waddesdon, and he was then released. When my brother was released from Waddesdon, we teamed up together. We got rid of the scooter, we swapped it for a bubble car. That meant we had a 3-seater bubble car. In those days, I hadn't got a driving licence, but a 3-seater bubble, we get 3 seats. A boy and a girl in a bubble car late at night. Oh, wonderful. We didn't have a home to go to. You know, we didn't have our own flat or places like that. Youngsters would do all kinds of things to get up to what they wanted to get up to. So we had a bubble car. And in that bubble car, my brother and I got into serious trouble. As I say, my brother loved guns. He loved weapons, air weapons. And we got into trouble going to Margate, going through London, taking pop shots, bang, bang, at ladies' bottoms, bang, bang, bang. Going through London, right? Now, we didn't think of the seriousness of what that kind of behaviour would be. We just thought it was fun. Of course, we were arrested, taken to court. I told the police that I'd done it because I didn't want my brother to get sent away. And I said my brother was asleep in the bubble car while I was driving along. Fabricated story. We were found both guilty and we both got sent away. I got sent to Waddesdon, my brother got sent to Maidstone prison. Went to Maidstone, Nick, who one of the trades was. And I went off to Dover Waddesdon and I was Hall Lodge Stewart. So, that's Waddesdon. Now, when I was released from Waddesdon, they gave me a suit of clothes. They gave me an education as best they could, a new suit of clothes, everything mapped out for me. The only thing they didn't give me was a change of heart. They gave me an old-fashioned suit, which as soon as I got out, I got rid of and got a flash mohair suit to go out, to be a lad, had my hair cut. You know, I came out a true Waddesdon graduate. In other words, I'd learned the tricks of the trade. I learned how to rob a house. I won't tell you the tricks in case you get tempted. I learned how to fly kites, which is to sign cheques to get away with it. I learned all kinds of crime. Waddesdon Institution was a wonderful place for an education. Serious. That's why they closed it down. I don't know what the remedy they have to do. I don't know what they did, but I've got some suggestions. So I came out of Waddesdon with a change of clothes that the government gave me, but I had no change of heart. And I had a 3-year career of undetected crime. Met up with a night, found again next to Mrs. Knight, who was a Christian, and I thought, wow, her religion's crazy, can't put up with this. Until I had a bad experience on LSD. Now, LSD is so bad, right? I warn anyone, don't ever get involved in it. Warn people about it. Don't get involved in the downward track of drugs. I had a bad experience with LSD. It sent me around the bend, okay? And it was during that bad trip on LSD that I cried out to the Lord to help me. I needed help. And I cried out to the Lord for help. And I was in Aylesbury at the time, going out of my mind on LSD. I'd given drugs that night to Pat Jones, to Bernie Gilbert, to Mick Ellis, and my brother himself was a tad of acid in the Crown pub. Now, I just want to say something more about that, about my brother, because he was released from Waddesdon, from prison, and we had planned. He didn't want to go back to jail. He came out on home leave, which meant when you go on home leave, you have a few weeks on the outside to get a job, prepare for your release from prison. My brother came out on home leave and he decided he wasn't going back to jail, regardless, couldn't cope with it. So we had planned to smuggle gold from Cyprus. And we'd made arrangements with an inmate, one of his colleagues on the out, in London, and we went there to do the deal. Collapsed, didn't work out. My brother was not going back to jail. So he was on the run for a year from prison. Okay? And he got a job, he got a girlfriend, and the girlfriend kept him on the straight and narrow. He got work, and he was working for a year at Pittston, working in Pittston, on where it was, doing, for the whole year. Now, on one occasion, this is Paddy Dunn's not here, but Paddy Dunn was a local copper, and he was the local CID man, and he was on the lookout to try and catch crooks, crime, and everybody knew Paddy Dunn was the CID. And he was renowned for his drinking in the pub, picking up information. One day, Paddy Dunn saw my brother in the Crown pub. And he came up and he tried to catch him out. He said, Mick! Mick realised who he was speaking, Paddy Dunn, ignored him. And Paddy Dunn went up to him and said, oh, Mick, thinking he caught a crook. Mick turned around and said, no, I'm not Mick, I'm Dave. I don't know where my brother is. So he told Paddy Dunn he was me. Paddy thought Paddy never caught the fish. And Malcolm Kirkham wrote a poem about Paddy Dunn, and I was going to relate it to you, but later on, you get the poem, because Malcolm wrote the poem.
The poem is called A Blessing in Disguise. There was a witless Irishman, an officer in the police, known and loved as Paddy Dunn. May his loathsome tribe decrease. For all his faults, and there are few, he knew the law down to the letter, or so he says, but we all knew he knew his Guinness better. He always was the optimist, on the bright side he did look. He thought one day when he's not pissed he's bound to catch a crook. But thank the Lord that Paddy's dim, and slow and drunk and thick, because if it weren't for coppers just like him, we might end up in nick.
So my brother was out at Walsall, on the run, there was me, had a bad trip on LSD, and I made my way to the Knight's home to see if I can get some help. During that bad experience of crying out to the Lord for help, I'm not going to go into that, I've written about that in my book, right? But what I'm going to say is this. I realised from that night I'd got to turn my life around, okay? And I knew I needed to change my ways, and I wanted to get help that I needed to live a right form of life. Now, all my friends that I'd given drugs to that night thought I'd gone crazy on acid. And Mick West, who I'd done a deal with, I'd stolen the colour TV set from Redfield's home in Winslow, swapped it for a Citroen DS car, and we'd done the deal. And he thought I was going to go to the police and confess to my crimes, right? And he was terrified. I couldn't use the car because I was felt guilty about. Now the thing is, not only did I have stolen property in my possession, I had things. These are the things. Listen to them. I had a 48-foot by 24-foot builder's shed, which stolen from the builder's yard in Berkhamsted. I'd got cars which I'd stolen. We were ringing cars, taking the number plates, taking the details. I've got cars which I'd stolen and were renting out to people. Right? In my house. I've got garage equipment, spraying equipment, welding equipment, nicked from farms around, and we had a business going on waterboard ground. Not our ground, but we erected the shed on waterboard ground. We were like villains. Now, I couldn't in conscience carry on my lifestyle using all that equipment once I decided to turn my life around. I believe the Lord had said to me, you know, you turn your life around, there is forgiveness of sins. We've got to learn that. And I then began to read. I learned to read. I wanted to find out the truth about life, the universe, and everything. And I could hardly read. The amount of reading I'd done so far had been the Black Dandy, the Beano, and Dr. Noah, J.P. Fleming's book. So I began to read the New Testament. I went to Southport Baptist Church. Martin White gave me a good news for modern man. And within 2 weeks, because it's in modern English, I could decipher. And I thought, well, I understand what he's talking about. You know, I understand this. And I learned from reading that New Testament why Jesus had to die. Nobody told me. I learned he had to die so that my sins could be forgiven. I read it there. And then when I went to church, because this is Strict Baptist Church, and then the Assembly of God Church, I began to hear those things. I thought, why didn't I hear these things before? But I learned through reading, and what I learned from that is that the Bible says, right, that God actually gives a person a new suit of clothes. His righteousness, when you believe. He forgives sin, gives you righteousness, and gives you the willingness, a new heart to carry on life. So I had, if you will, not an outward dress, but an inward dress. Not an outward show, but an inward change. I wanted to be different, and I began to learn myself. Now, I'll just give you an example. This will make me laugh. I hope it will, because it's true. I didn't have much time for people that were concerned about dressing up. And I'm going to talk about head coverings later, because it is important. It's significant because it's another story. I knew that God looks on the inward, doesn't look on the outward appearance. He actually looks on the heart of man. Right? Now, I went to church in my overalls against a lot of people. People think that we should dress up for church. And I used to go, well, it didn't matter to me. So I went to church, and then the minister said, could anybody, would you ask me, David, would I give a testimony to the church as to what the Lord had done for me that week? I said, yes, of course I can. So I got up in the overalls, and I went a week back, and I told them about the temptation I'd had. My car battery was flat. I needed a new car battery. And we talked about 2 or 3 months after my conversion. The natural thing for me was to go and nick a new car battery. There's Adam's garage, nip over the fence, undo the bonnet, take the car battery, put it in my car, drive off. That was the temptation. Now I believed, right, that I was being tempted by the devil. So this is in church. I said, bugger off, Satan. In church. Can you imagine? Dressed in overalls, telling something to bugger off in the church. Afterwards, one of the senior men came up to me and said, David, he said, you don't talk like that in church. And I didn't know he was telling me off, but my friend afterwards told me. But the point was, it was fact. It was a true situation. I said that. I'm going to tell you another story later. Now, the same gentleman that told me off, no, he didn't tell me off, he gently reproved me, moderated my language. He said to me, look, the good news from the Bible you're reading, he says, is not actually a reliable translation. What you need to do is read the authorised version, the King James Version. And he said the reason for that is because the King James Version is more faithful to the original text, and it preserves the truth of who Jesus actually is, the deity of Christ. The Good News Version doesn't actually teach those things. So I said, okay, I read it, and I looked into it, and I learned that he was probably right. So I began to read the authorised versions, difficult it might have been. The value of that was this: it improved my English. It gave me the ability to read books which I needed to read to keep me on the straight and narrow. I began to read books like John Bunyan, John Calvin, John Owen, Martin Luther, all the old reformers' books that this chapel building taught, the doctrines of grace, you know, the doctrines of predestination, things like that. I learned these things through reading myself using the old-fashioned language. Okay. Now, that was good. Not only that, it prepared me for higher education. Having learned to read and understand, I educated myself, and later on, I did actually want to get more education. I didn't want to go to Bible college because I didn't want to come out like these vicars that were sopping, you know, wet, and didn't know what life was all about. I hadn't lived. So I decided not to go to Bible college. I would go to a teacher training college, learn to teach, and then I could teach any subject I like, provided I knew the subject. That's what I did later on. Now, I've spoken about dress. Another occasion I'm going to talk about dress now, and then later another one, because it is important. One Sunday afternoon, in those days, people thought you should keep a Sabbath day, which is a Sunday. I didn't believe that was the case at all. I thought that Jesus talked about the rest that we have. He said, when you rest in Christ, that's the Sabbath. Not a day in a week, doesn't make it any better. Never mind. Sunday morning, I was in the overalls, I had 5 urchins in the street, young lads. I'm going to take these to church, I said. Paul Mitchell, Tatty, 5 or 6 other, Jock Ness, down the grammar school, his son, and I took them to church. I was dressed in their overalls. We went to the evangelical church in Aylesbury, and I said to these lads, look, the Bible says if you go to a place where there's an invitation, don't sit in the high place, sit in the low place, and be modest. And when the steward of the house sees you there, he'll elevate you and put you to a high place, give you honour. So I said to these lads, right, when we go to this church, we'll sit on the floor, because we're dressed in our own clothes. So we did. We went there, sat on the floor, full of people, and sure enough, the steward gets up, come sit in the front, sat us right in the front where they got the communion going on. And it was at the time what we call an open communion, where open communion meant that if you're a believer, you can partake of the bread and the wine, and it's open to believers if they want to. The thing was, when the cup and the bread was being passed around, there's our row of urchins and me dressed in overalls. We would pass by. They judged us by the outer appearance. They judged us because we were dressed odd. They just skipped. I felt a little bit miffed about that, but no mind. The next thing was in the Bible, I learned I should be baptised. Now, the Bible clearly tells me, when a person believes, believers should tell the person that believes to get baptised. You know, they instruct them to be baptised. Nobody told me to get baptised. Some people thought, who is this strange person who's a bit concerned about me? So I decided I'm going to get myself baptised. I went to Fleet Street Church, Holy Street, it's a Pentecostal church, and I asked Pastor Bruce, his son now runs a church, to baptise me. And they did. They had a baptismal ceremony with other candidates at Lyons Avenue Baptist Church, and I was baptised one Sunday morning at their baptistry. Now, what would you do with stolen gear? If you got gears, what would the sheriff of Nottingham do if he discovered a place with criminals? What on earth would he do? I had stolen gear, so much so, when I went to the police, they recovered, in those days in 1971, over £1,000 worth of stolen gear. That's probably worth about 20 grand now. But the point was, what would you do? Coming back to Nick West, who I told you earlier, I swapped the colour TV set. Right, his mates, so-called, his enemies, grassed him up to the police. And the police came to see him and arrested him and charged him with stealing a colour TV set. So he told the police where he got it from. The police came to see me, and I knew what I had to do. I told the police exactly what happened to me, what I'd done during that year, because some of the stuff I'd taken back, by the way, managed to get it back. And I had to go to court. I appeared in court. Mick West nearly got the sack. The judge, Tetley his name is, when he judged me, they said to me, these are the words. He said, we've considered, Mr. Clark, what we ought to do. I've told them the story, what I'm telling you today. We've considered what we ought to do, and your evident desire to become a martyr is one thing we are not going to gratify. You were conditionally discharged for a period of 3 years. That meant I was free to go. No charge, no nothing, no probation, nothing. Malcolm Kirkland was not here, but he thought I was a player. He thought I'd pull the wool over the magistrate's eyes. I hadn't at all. I was telling the truth, straightforward. So, I met a load, when after that time I learned, I met Christians who had all kinds of beliefs. Some believed this, some believed that, all kinds of things. So I had to read myself. Now I read myself, and I actually educated myself. I learned what it was, that God forgives sins. I know that God declares a sinner He justifies people that believe. And I learned about God's predestination. All things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to his purposes. And then I learned there were other churches that believed the things I'd come to believe in, and it was the Waddesdon Strict Baptist Church. And it was that church, as the first church, the only church that I actually joined, really. First church I joined, because they held these truths. And it's then that I learned they were in fellowship with the church here. And it's these truths that A, God forgives sins, the word, men don't forgive, but God does forgive. Now if I'd known I'm forgiven and God's given me freedom and grace to live as I should, you know, you wouldn't spoil that privilege, you wouldn't trample that down. So, knowing those things gave me the impetus to live the right way. So I had a great light and knowledge. And one thing that I found odd in those days, it was at the time of the hippie movement. And people used to walk around church, young people with stickers on their shoulders, smile, God loves you. And I thought, it's a bit inappropriate. I thought, why don't they put a sticker saying, God is angry with you again every day? Because that's just as appropriate. You know, people have got an imbalanced view of what God's like. I mean, if God did, what would happen to me? You know, my lifestyle, if I don't turn my life around, what would happen to me? What happened to my brother? I'm going to tell you about. Okay, that's the important thing. Join the Beaten Church, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to come up to my brother's lifestyle. What happened? My brother, knowing my life change, he was unaffected. He had a flamboyant lifestyle, right? He liked his flash cars. He had his Rolls Royce. He built 2 houses. He was the managing director of a company in Milton Keynes. He had the mayor of the city come to open the houses, his business, right? He went through trials and difficulties. Divorce, depression. He went off to Thailand. Got in trouble in Thailand in his movie-making business. You can imagine what he was getting up to. He had to flee the country. He went across to the Philippines, opened a travel agency. It wasn't long before he was in trouble again. He got arrested. And he was arrested. In fact, I was teaching. I haven't told you yet. I went through higher education. Well, my brother was off doing his own thing. I trained to be a teacher. I graduated with a certificate in education from Wolverhampton Polytechnic. The teaching certificate was awarded by Birmingham University. I taught electronics for 22 years in colleges of higher and further education. The church at Beaton ordained me as a minister to preach, whilst my brother was out doing his trips. And he got arrested and sent away to prison for 16 years, where he died of tuberculosis. Now, when I got news of my brother's arrest in the Philippines on the national television network when I was in Fareham, I was horrified, shocked. And it was that moved me to publish my first book, Converted on LSD Trip. And my college principal refused to write forward to the book because it overtly referred to drug taking. Well, I wasn't talking about drug taking at all. I was simply using the Bucks Herald headline news, which told of my conversion, to attract attention to people to read the story. But that's what happened. So, Michael, in the prison, was absolutely... He went, after 5 years, he'd lost weight, his teeth were coming out, he was dying, he'd got his wife that he married in the Philippines died of leukemia, and he was at the end of his life. He feared death, he wanted to die. He wrote to me, and he's in a dreadful state. Now, whilst, you know, whatever you think about people, Joe, when you come to that end, you can't help but have pity. The next year he wrote to me, and he'd been reading C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. And he said he'd come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I could see in his letters, the way he wrote what he was saying, I could see there was a change of heart, what I had experienced. And I had sent word to him, said, get an inmate in that jail to baptise as a believer. And he did, in an oil drum, in the prison, right back in the book. And he met with several guys. New Believer Prison is the largest prison in the Philippines. It houses over, in the maximum compound where my brother was, there's over 13,000 inmates. Inside there is death row. And Gordon and Smith and I went out to see my brother to help him, to work with him. Not only that, we worked with hundreds of criminals in that jail. And my brother and I worked with them to help them. My brother worked with inmates in that jail, and we published a book called Trojan Warriors. And there are 66 testimonies of converted criminals from crime. Some 22 are on death row, telling their life story in that book. We had trouble, but we didn't. We sorted it out. One man who we appointed as our mission, he'd done 14 years. He killed a policeman. He got his leg blown off in a gun running. After 40 years of prison, 5 years with my brother working in the jail, he turned his life around, and we sent him back to his city. to go and share the gospel in Baguio City Jail, then get provincial jail, and he went out there and we paid him money, because there's no social security in the Philippines, to keep him to work with the family. And he did a successful work, and he's there to this day. He's built 2 churches and a theological institute. Well, but write him by email. A success. It works. What this chapel stood for, namely the teachings of God's grace. God is gracious. He forgives sin, He justifies, He turns your life around, and if you follow Christ, then you can go on a straight and narrow. It gives you the building blocks to turn your life around. Doesn't matter how bad you've been in the past. We can teach these things, because Michael learnt it, I learnt it, William Pollock learnt it, some of these criminals in the prison have learnt it. Right? So that's what we learned, and we decided to build the first ever teaching training college in jail, whereby we would teach criminals how to share the gospel when they go back to their cities and towns and villages, and so that work was begun. And we did have trouble, but never mind. Now the summary of this story really is this, if I can sum up. My life was turned around because I believed the gospel. I read and educated myself. Education is a must to anybody that wants to turn his life around, because they need to educate themselves. As the radio broadcast said today, anyone that turns his life around has got to have a want to change. He's got to steer his own ship, drive the car himself, not others do it for you. Read yourself, learn yourself, follow, educate yourself. And what we learned was what this chapel taught from 1792, namely the doctrines of grace, particular redemption, justification by faith, the predestination of God's grace. All of these things are the things that this church taught and what the Bearden Church taught. Now let me come back to the other story about the Bearden Chapel. I withdrew from the Bearden Chapel years ago because of tradition clouded the gospel. Now, we taught in the Strict Baptist churches, his Bible teaches that ladies should cover their heads in the chapel where they worship God. A covering of some form. Tradition. And the Bible clearly teaches that. What it signifies is that the woman is subject to her husband. She's not a domineering woman like Jezebel, right? And the demeanour of a man and a woman is quite clear. The man should respect his wife and love his wife like Christ loved the church. And the woman, in response, should honour her husband, respect him in every respect, and a head covering to show she's under subjection to her husband. That's what the head covering means. Okay? Now, in the Bearden Chapel, I was trying to help out a young woman that had gone through divorce. Beautiful looking girl. She came to chapel dressed in black, tight trousers, shiny trousers, showed her figure off like a Coca-Cola bottle. She came to chapel distressed, and I invited her, so I was preaching the gospel, preaching the word to her. And after the meeting, one of the old women came up to me and said, "Benedict, next time you bring a lady to chapel, make sure she covers her head." Oh, dear me, what's going on? The tradition had overclouded the mission. There was a woman in need of help. There was another woman, a senior woman, telling me to make another woman cover her head when it's totally inappropriate. If that girl was a believer and wanted to follow Christ, she wanted to be, to be reasonable in her behaviour, she would do that naturally. Yeah? That's why I said about covering your head. It's a funny story, it's real. Absolutely real. Now, because of that kind of tradition in the Strict Baptist Church, that's why they're dying out. This church is deceased because they held on tradition and they threw the baby out with the bathwater. The doctrines of grace. Jesus came into the world to save sinners, that he died to save his people from their sins, that he gives power to live in this world, he gives us the ability to live in this world. He teaches us the way, all found in the Bible. Now, coming to the story. Now, I've decided, because a lot of people can't read, the sort of people I want to reach, in jail and prison, we decided to turn our story into a punk rock opera. And I've written a punk rock opera called Ball Story, and we got all the songs ready. I've got a band now I've appointed to do the music tracks. Thankfully, last week, the present governor, Waddesdon is chuffed to pieces to want to run this story as a punk rock opera in Waddesdon. And he wants to do 2 batches of 100 students, bang, followed by another, to tell the story. We hope, it's our desire, and if you've got any form of desire to help people, right? You can't turn criminals out in the street without trying to help them out. If one is saved from a criminal lifestyle, through us helping, that's good. But if 2 or 3, the potential is 200 inmates are going to listen to this story through a punk rock medium. In the book which I wrote called Waddesdon Boys, they've got 10 copies already in Waddesdon. The man said to me, if we get it in Waddesdon, that will open the doors to other jails. Look at the value of education, the value of encouraging to help people turn their life around through reading the gospel. And that's my story, and that's, you know, well, that's it really. One more thing before I close about Jesus dying. When he was on the cross, the women that looked after him and provided for him, he said to the women, he said, don't weep for me. Let me just read it to you. Don't weep for me, he said. Okay, yeah. Jesus turning unto them said, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in the which they shall say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never gave bear, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills cover us. For if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry? Now I haven't got a clue what that meant. I now learned what it means. Jesus was telling the women that were weeping for him, he said, don't weep for yourselves, Lord. Don't weep for me. In the very near future, your city, Jerusalem, is going to be destroyed by fire, by the Romans. And you're going to be, some people are going to say, cry, call for the hills to fall upon us. And that happened in 70 AD. Jerusalem was destroyed. The Romans destroyed the temple. And Jesus said, simply said, if they do these things in the green tree, that's when wood is cut from a tree and it's still got sap in it. It burns, but not very well. If you get dry wood, a wonderful fire burns. Now, I'm just going to suggest to you something. The burning, the destruction of Jerusalem was symbolic of God's wrath and anger against people like me. Just think what would happen. Look at my brother. He did turn his life around, right? And he did die as a believer. But what would have happened, and what does happen to men that die in their sins? Jesus is simply warning, look, listen, think about your lifestyle, that's all. So, that's the word I want to share with people and encourage people. I have written all about this in the book Converted on LSD and in Waddesdon Boys and Watch Out for the Punk Rock Opera. That's it. Okay?